Hi guys, we're going to be discussing the idea of the holy of Rudolf Otto and his theory. I am Juan Maldonado.
I'm Amina Aminuddin.
There's Mohammed Askari.
So I'm just going to give you an overview of what we're going to do. As I mentioned before, we're going to be dealing with Rudolf Otto. So Amina is going to give us an introduction of Otto's life. I'm going to be talking about Otto's theory, and Mohammed is going to be giving some conclusions and some criticisms of Otto's theory. Make sure you check the link of the video. There is a list of questions that just we prepare for you so we can engage in the conversation, and there are going to be some links, some video links, so you can follow along with what we're talking about. Hope you enjoy.
Hi guys, I'm going to be introducing Rudolf Otto. Our presentation is on him. Rudolf Otto was a German theologian and a historian of religions. His area of interest was the emotional aspects and elements of human religious experience. He was from a prosperous family from the village of Penn near Hanover, and he studied at the universities of Erlangen and Göttingen. He earned his doctorate with a thesis on aspects of the theology of Martin Luther and a second on the philosopher Immanuel Kant, two figures who helped form the modern German religious and intellectual thought. He first taught at the University of Breslau and later at a divinity school of historic Marburg University. He was interested in German politics and took interest in the university administration. Although he was a devout Protestant Christian, he showed great appreciation for beliefs and sentiments in other religions and cultures. Most of his scholarly work focuses on mysticism in both Western and Eastern civilizations. Shortly before the World War I, Otto took a 2-year tour of the Middle East and Asia, which included stays in Egypt, North Africa, India, China, and Japan. So this goes to show that he's familiar with all the big religions, naturally all the Western monotheistic religions, as well as Islam, because he was in Middle East for a long period, and showed a great interest in Hinduism because he was a master of Sanskrit, and goes to show his experience and his knowledge of all these religions, which he could compare in his scholarly work and come to the conclusion that he did.
So as you was seen before, as Amina was explained before, an important fact that we need to establish at this moment is that Otto was a German theologian in a time where theology in Germany was extremely important. In fact, Germany at the time was the center of theology. It was the center of discussion in academic circles, where many of these dialogues were happening on new ideas of God, and that is important for us to understand in order to grasp the idea that Otto was trying to develop. It is also important to remember that Otto was a Christian. He was a Christian most of his life, despite the fact that he decided to study most of the tradition of the East, these Eastern religions. He remained a Christian and he worked within that framework, so it's important to remember that. But why is that important? Otto did not think that other religions, especially Eastern traditions, he didn't think that those religions were completely false. I mean, he admitted the fact that some of these religions had some truth in it, just that he considered Christianity to be the truest of these traditions, and that is an important thing for us to remember. Also, part of the idea that Otto was coming from a strong theological German tradition, it's important for us to know, because he rooted his argument in philosophical argument, not only on pure theological ideas, but also on strong philosophical argumentation, and we'll see why, and we'll see how that goes in his theory. So I'm going to talk about more in detail about what is Otto's theory, what is the theory that he develops in the idea of the holy. He begins his train of thought by setting up the problem. And at the time of Otto, as we were saying before, in Germany, most of these theologians were looking for an understanding of God that was mostly a rational understanding. Most people were discussing, getting together in universities, in centers of study, and they were saying, you know what, we really want to understand God, so let's use rational argumentation, philosophical argumentation to get to the bottom of the idea of God. And Otto saw that as a problem, especially in his own tradition, in the Christian tradition. You know, in the Christian tradition, at the time especially, one can see that the concept of God was not only rooted on scripture, on special revelation, but also on deep philosophical argumentation, especially during the time of scholasticism, as you all know, times where the Catholic Church was developing these great theories in arguments for the existence of God, for the nature of God, with Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, and this, well, not St. Augustine, but Thomas Aquinas. It was the great time of scholasticism in the Catholic Church. So much of the theology that came from Germany at the time, and Otto was part of that, was rooted on that tradition. It was the understanding of God in a rational way. So Otto argued that, you know, this is important. I mean, we have to establish that. Otto said that the rational understanding of God, it's important. It is important because it frames orthodoxy, what we call dogma. Because of this, people know a framework of work, and they say, okay, now if we go beyond these lines, we're out of orthodoxy. So Otto admitted the rational argumentation is important for the development of theology in essence. But he said this type of rational argumentation is not what the mystics usually talk about when they claim to have an experience of God, or it's not necessarily what they're concerned about. You know, Otto was saying, you know, the mystics, when they talk about an experience of God, they're not talking about a rational aspect per se, they're talking about something else, and he wanted to get at the bottom of that. So he argued that although it is important to take into consideration the rational understanding of God, he said that it was perhaps even more important to take into consideration the non-rational aspect of the understanding of God. And that is something that must be studied in the field of theology. So as you were saying in the quotation that we have from Otto's book, The Idea of the Holy, what he was trying to say is that the church, in his elite the Christian church, was overemphasizing the rational understanding of God and kind of neglecting the non-rational aspect of the experience that people claim to have of the divine. So he was saying, we need to get back to that aspect of the non-rational and understand that not everything that we understand about God comes from the rational side, but some of this understanding comes through experience. Now, the question is, how do we do that? Well, Otto proposes going back to religious experiences, analyzing them, and trying to figure out these experiences, and trying to say, well, what is it going on during these experiences? I mean, if I talk to a mystic, if I talk to somebody that is having a religious experience, what is it? What's going on? How can we understand this? How can we explore this? Well, he says that we will be able to understand these religious experiences if we understand that there is a state of mind. He says that we will be able to understand this experience if we understand that there is a state of mind, what he calls the numinous. Well, what is the numinous? Well, what he's trying to get at is that there's an experiential state of being that is no other, like no other experience that human beings have. Well, how is it that Otto proceeds to do that? Well, Otto finds that there's something important behind the idea of the word holy, and this is key for the understanding of his theory. He tried to frame the word holy and put it into question, investigate the word in itself, and say, what is this word? What does that mean? In his view, holiness or sacredness, the concept of it, captures a state of being, captures this idea that comes through religious experience. So he wants to investigate what is it that the idea of the holy leads to. So in his analysis of the word holy, Otto found that the Christian tradition, for example, uses the idea of the holy as something related to the idea of being moral. When you say, that person is such a holy person, or you can sense a feeling of holiness when you're around this other person. Well, that created a sense of being moral. That person having good morals, or being decent. But then Otto said, why is that happening? Where do we come from? Where are we getting this idea from? He doesn't deny that this might be correct in a way. He doesn't deny that a person that is holy, or that we can call holy, is a moral person. He's not denying that. But what he argues is that the interpretation of this word, the word holy, as a moral category, might be a result of an experience of the holy, not the holy in itself. And this is something different, which doesn't necessarily have a moral aspect. He's saying, well, if you take the word holy in itself, it doesn't necessarily have to be a moral word, a moral description. And although people might live better moral lives because of the experience of the holy, the state of mind in itself is not a moral state. That was Otto's argument. In order to get to the root of the word holy, Otto decided to study different languages and see how the word holy gets translated in different languages. And this is important for us to know because before anything else, Otto was a theologian. He was an expert on different languages. So he decided to take the word holy and try to see where can we get from this word in different languages. So focusing especially on the Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, Otto argued that all of these concepts have different connotations and do not necessarily associate with the Hebrew word kadosh, which is often translated as the good. He said that these other words, the Greek and the Latin, had different meanings that needed to be explored. So here, what Otto is trying to say, and this is important for us to know, is that the numinous, this concept of the numinous, is a sui generis state of mind. By that he means that it is a unique, independent state of mind, and we need to understand it by itself. So, again, what is the numinous? Well, the numinous is the object of this experience, of the holiness. Whatever we experience of the holiness, this is the object of experience. So, as the example of Abraham that he provides says, this object of the numinous gives this idea of a creature feeling, this sense of dependence that arises in the mind to know that there is something else. Well, these creature feelings he describes as the idea that there's something bigger than us. Perhaps the emotion of a creature being submerged in an overwhelming state that you just know that you are under some sort of authority, that there's a sense of a relative dependence that is not necessarily a complete dependence, but you are not being yourself. So this is not meant to be a dependence in the natural sense of the word, as in like my child depends on me, or I depend on my grandparents, but rather more like a negative way, as in like I am not a completely and wholly independent being, and that's a key concept that we need to get from Otto. In the numinous, we become aware that we are not alone, that we are in a relationship with something else. So how do we make sense of that? Well, Otto describes this experience as, he defines it as the mysterious tremendum and fascination. And so I'm going to explain in parts what is it that Otto is trying to talk about when he describes this thing. So in the idea of the tremendum, he divides this in three sections, or describes it in three parts. One of them is the sense of awfulness. In the face of misery, a sense of awe. In the face of something that we cannot understand. It is something like awe or dread, or like an emotional state, like feeling awful. The second state is the idea of majesty, a sense that we are overpowered by the holy, by this experience, like this element which gives rise to most especially the attitude of religious humility. What does that mean? Well, the idea that there's an awareness of being connected to something else. The mystics, for example, feel fairly insignificant in relation to the universe, and those are ideas that give idea to humility, spiritual humility. The third aspect that Otto mentions under the umbrella of the tremendum is the idea of urgency, of energy, a sense that this is happening right now and that this is important, that it cannot be dismissed, a sense of an incredible energy or urgency that there is the divine reality. So it is no wonder that mystics have often used the language of love to express this element, to express this immediate element of urgency and energy. So concluding, there is a second aspect of what Otto describes as the mysterium. What is the mysterium? Well, it's this experience of something wholly other. Part of it's also connected to the part of the idea, this idea that we are creatures, like we feel like creatures, and sensing that we are creatures and we experience a creator, that we are under, that we're not wholly independent, and that there is something that is fundamentally different than us, but that we're getting connected to. So that is important. That is part of what he describes as the mysterium. And thirdly, there's the idea of fascination, this idea of beauty and wonder that I feel fascinated when I see this. That not only refers to fear, but it's also the idea of the beauty of the experience of the holy. So in conclusion, it is important to know that Otto claims that this is not merely a psychological state, but that it is an inner state that reflects something real that is outside of us. So unlike other people that work on theory of religion, like James, and people that claim that perhaps this is it could be described as a psychological state. He said, well, this is something that real, that reflects something outside of us. So now it is important to have this, study this, and say, well, what are we making of that? Well, we come into some criticisms of Rudolf Otto's theory of the holy.
Hi. So in this section of the presentation, I want to talk about the idea of the sacred and its development in the West. So basically I'll cover the relevance of this idea of the sacred, as well as some of the critiques of this idea. The goal is to see the relevance of Otto's work and where his thought fits in the bigger picture. Otto's thought is somewhat of a breakthrough for modern scholarship. He challenges the dominant reductionist narrative by asserting that religious experience was fundamentally sui generis, which means that it was something in and of itself. It was something that was independent of other psychological explanations. At the same time, he emphasizes the esoteric and mystical aspect of religion, which he describes as the point of unity among all religions. So, to do this, I want to focus on these two fundamental aspects of Otto's thought, which is his opposition to modern reductionist thought and the centrality of mystical experience of the numinous. To do this, I'm going to discuss a trend of thought in the West that is called traditionalism or perennialism, which is without a doubt the greatest critique of modernity and modern thought, as well as proponent of religious mysticism in the West. Traditionalism began with the works of René Guénon, who is a French philosopher and thinker, who sought to address the crisis of modern man, the spiritual crisis of modern man, in light of the perennial wisdom that lies at the heart of all religious traditions. Traditionalism will allow us to get a more in-depth understanding of this idea of the sacred and its relevance to modern thought. Okay. All right, so now we're going to show a short clip of basically a traditionalist thinker named Hossein Nasr, who's a scholar of religion, who's an eminent proponent of this perspective. His work has had great influence in the West and in academia. And like Rudolf Otto and many of the theorists that we've studied in the course, he was chosen to give the Gifford Lectures.
Tradition, and so I chose for my talk Recovery of the Sacred, Tradition and Perennialism in the Contemporary World. So let me go back very, very quickly to basic definitions. I'm glad Mr. Lakhani spoke a few minutes about the meaning of tradition itself. Let me add that this word gained its particular meaning at a time when the West had already become inundated in almost all of its aspects by an ideology called modernism. And to distinguish traditional truth, that is how human beings had thought and lived according to divine dictum, before this event, it was necessary to use a particular term. And the term tradition was used rather than religion, because religion itself at that time was looked upon, especially in continental Europe, in a pejorative way by many people, and it itself had become, to a large extent, influenced by modernism. And therefore, the late René Guénon, followed by Ananda Coomaraswamy and Fridtjof Schuon, the three great masters of the traditional school, used the word tradition in this particular sense. But let's come back to the basic understanding that tradition means the sacred and its continuation over temporal sequence within a particular civilization. So it implies both a sacred origin and the continuation of the teachings which are sacred and which involve art, thought, life, every different aspect of our existence here on earth. Then we have the term traditional. Of course, that's very easy, and the way we use it is a person who accepts or who looks upon an idea which has the color of tradition. As for traditionalists, we use this for those who have totally accepted the traditional point of view. There's no one on earth, including atheistic philosophers, who do not say something sometime which has a partial truth in it. Nothing would exist without partial truth. And therefore, does not make tradition. A traditionalist is a person who accepts the traditional point of view, who accepts tradition as defined, which embraces the whole of life. Finally, we have the term traditionalism, which unfortunately, despite the excellent book of Professor Olmedo, who must be here somewhere with this very title, has also gained a pejorative connotation, especially in France and Italy, because a number of people have come about, in fact they came about a long time ago, who took the teachings of Guénon as being a kind of philosophy called traditionalism, as if it were another religion, as if it were another revelation. And therefore, certain authors, including the late Dr. Martin Lings, wrote specifically against the dangers of using traditionalism in this way. But I think for this conference, we must accept its positive and very positive connotation, that is the ism with which we're so much used, which incorporates the truth and the teachings of tradition. A short word also about perennialism. While the traditional school was very strong in Europe, the term perennialism was not very much used. The term perennialism came to be used in conjunction with tradition, especially in North America, and to some extent in Great Britain, but especially in North America, and today it's very prevalent. And again, it's very important to distinguish between the understanding of traditionalists of the perennial philosophy, and as this term is used in a general sense by many people. This term became popularized by Aldous Huxley, a British novelist, in the 1940s, and since then has been used a great deal. Yes, we who consider ourselves to be followers of tradition all believe in the perennial philosophy, but our understanding of it is traditional, not a kind of general conceptual unity between various ideas from different civilizations without a root in sacred revelations and without an aspect of praxis. And I think it's very important to keep these terms in mind at the beginning of this very important two-day conference. Now, at the heart of tradition stands the sacred, with the capital S. The sacred, metaphysically, is that which is totally itself, independent of any other reality, therefore absolute, and encompassing every reality that is infinite. These are attributes of the divine ultimate reality. So the sacred is really another way of speaking about the divine. The reason we use the sacred is that it also flows into human life in such a way that it gives meaning to human life that is palpable. You can all smell the perfume of the sacred. Friedrich Schwann always used to say that one of the characteristics of modern man is that he has lost his sense of smell of the sacred. The perfume of the sacred he no longer smells. So I always want to come back to this idea of the sacred, about which I've written a great deal during the last few decades. And of course, other traditionalist writers, especially Friedrich Schwann, paid a great deal of attention to this term. This is also have many, of course, derivatives with which I will not become entangled right now. So the origin of tradition is the sacred. Sacred with the capital S. And tradition, which is related, of course, to the word for transmission in English, is the transmission of that sacred presence down the road within various civilizations, which we therefore call traditional. And within them, there are arts, there are sciences, there are philosophies, there are social structures, practically every aspect of life, including the political and economic, which have the perfume of the sacred, which are related in their structure to archetypal realities issuing from the divine source, from the sacred with a capital S.
Okay, now I'm going to discuss some of the critiques of Otto's theory of the sacred. One of the most important works on the idea of the sacred in our contemporary world is perhaps a book called Knowledge and the Sacred by Hossein Nasr, who you just watched a video of. According to Nasr, those who want to confront modern rationalism and reductionism, such as Otto, place religion outside of the domain of reason. Nasr says regarding the view of the sense of the sacred as irrational, that it is of, I quote, "It is of much interest to note that attempts such as those of Otto to relate the sacred to the irrational have attracted the greatest deal of interest during the century. This fact implies that the relation of intellectual truth or knowledge to the sacred has been ignored, precisely because of the depleting of knowledge of its sacred content." So, according to the traditionalists, this bifurcation is a direct result of one of the fundamental errors of modernity, which is rationalism, which limits all knowledge to man's individual logical analysis of mental concepts, and divorces it from spiritual realities and ultimately the sacred, which is defined as the very reality of God. The traditional view identifies the intellect as the instrument of knowledge within man. It is seen as the ray of light whose source is the sacred and allows man to know the sacred. Christian mystic Meister Eckhart describes the intellect as that which relates man to the sacred in a direct manner and which enables knowledge to become the central means of access to the sacred. The sacred and its manifestation through time and space is central to the traditionalist perspective. The sacred, traditionally understood, includes all aspects of life, and it's not limited to pure mysterium tremendum, or the experience of the holy, as Otto explains it. In traditional societies, every aspect of life and thought were derived from and reflected a sense of the sacred. From the moral system to the theology to arts and architecture, the sacred was at once all transcendent and all immanent, meaning all present. Otto seems to solely focus on the transcendence of God when he speaks about the sense of tremendum and createdness in the face of the mystery. Again, this reflects the modern landscape from which he speaks. According to Nasr, it is the loss of the sense of the sacred in modern man which leads him to view the sacred as wholly other. This view sees the sacred in terms of the profane, with the lens of the profane. In traditional wisdom, the opposite was true. The profane was seen in terms of the sacred. The traditional perspective is important because it provides an understanding of the sacred, as understood through tradition, and not in the parameters of modern thought. This perspective challenges the fundamental aspects of modern thought, the core of which Nasr describes as this forgetfulness of the sense of the sacred, which is reflected in every aspect of modern civilization. Tradition, with a capital T, as Nasr described in the video, has been the means through which the sacred manifests itself in time and space. Alright. Another key One of the most relevant global issues today is the environmental crisis. Now, how does the sacred and this idea of the sacred relate to the environmental crisis? Well, Nasr describes this crisis as a modern phenomenon, and thus a result of modern science, which is based on modern philosophy, which I will not go too deep into, but he explains that at its core, the environmental crisis. He explains that at its core, the environmental crisis is a result of modern man's forgetfulness of the sacred, that is at once the center of both himself and the cosmic environment. I quote, "Modern man, having rebelled against heaven, has created a science based not on the light of the intellect, but on the powers of human reason to sift the data of the senses." In other words, the sacred affects every aspect of human civilization. Modern civilization has sought to remove the sacred, and in its place has placed the human individual at the center and above all else. To summarize, The modern view of man and nature sees nature as something to be controlled, something to have mastery over, something to possess and exploit for man's desires. Whereas the traditional view sees nature as a manifestation of the sacred, and thus something to be preserved.
If you think of stories in Luke, for example, Luke's very fond of angels. Angels announcing this and angels announcing that. And if you read them carefully, you'll note that the reaction is always they're frightened out of their minds. And but it's not a sense of it's not a sense though of one's not frightened by something horrid. One's not frightened by something bad. But one's frightened by something that's literally uncanny, and what it comes from is beyond our ken.
But no matter how favorable the outcome, many believe that the actual origins of reported personal religious experiences are more likely to be more human than divine.
The brain is capable of lots and lots of illusory and hallucinatory activity. In fact, that's one of the things that it does best. And what we need to do is keep our wits about us on what it's likely telling us that's really true and what is sort of just a story.
I think everybody who's had such an experience asks himself the question, how do I know I just haven't had some sort of an emotional experience that can be psychologically explained away? And I think there are two answers to that question. First of all, in one sense, I think that a genuine experience of God is self-authenticating. That when you meet God personally, in the way that happened to me in 1965 on that September evening, it so transformed my life that I simply couldn't convince myself this was merely psychological, that I was merely having an emotional experience. It was a reality that imposed itself upon me.
The hunch is that religious experiences are the products of some delusive belief-producing mechanism of some sort or another, wish fulfillment, perhaps psychosis of some sort or another, perhaps a neurophysiological disorder. There's complication upon complication, because even if this would be true of some types of religious experience, it might not be true of others. I think it's very healthy to remember that most mystics are very sane, well-balanced, and often quite intelligent and well-educated people.
Philosopher Richard Swinburne says that what holds for all experiences, including religious ones, is a basic principle of rationality he calls the principle of credulity. He writes that, "My conclusion about the considerable evidential force of religious experience depends on my principle of credulity that apparent perceptions ought to be taken at their face value in the absence of positive reason for challenge." So, if there's no good reason to question the experience, it is rational to believe that it exists. That would hold for religious experiences as well.
We do operate with the assumption that, for example, basic perceptual beliefs, I'm talking ordinary perception now, memory beliefs, simple intuitions or intuitions about simple necessary truths like 2 + 3 = 5, that these things are, as I say, we accept these reports at face value. But now, if you allow that, Swinburne's point, then religious experiences are presumptively valid. That is, they're innocent until proven guilty. So who has the burden of proof? The person who's trying to discredit the burden of proof is on the person who's trying to discredit the experience.
One of the great evidentialist arguments is that you should never believe anything on insufficient evidence. Well, that sounds all right, but you have to say, well, what do you mean by sufficient? And James, rather provocatively really, said sometimes you should believe when there is insufficient evidence. And the sort of case he was thinking of, he gave 3 conditions of it. First of all, it must be a forced option. That is, there's no alternative. So you might say, well, either I've got to swim for the shore from a sinking ship, or I've got to go down with the ship. I've got to make that decision. It's a forced option. And then he said, well, these cases, it must be a vital option. That is, it must really make a significant difference to the whole of your life. And thirdly, James said it must be a living option, not something which is just theoretical, but something actually presents itself to you as a challenge in your culture. And he thinks, well, Christianity, for example, is a living option for you, whereas probably being an ancient Aztec isn't. Now, that's what James had in mind. Religion is really about having a fuller, more vital life. If that's true, then in that situation you can't wait for the evidence.
But I want to hasten to add that I don't think, in fact, we are in such a situation, because I think that God would not abandon us to simply that sort of groundless decision. I think that he has both provided sufficient evidence for his existence in nature and in conscience, as well as, I think, through the ministry of his own Spirit in the heart of every person. God draws persons to himself.
If you're going to have a personal relationship with God, there's got to be some mutual awareness of each other. I don't think God has any trouble perceiving us. That's not where the problem would lie. So that's why I think that the mystical perception is not of interest only, or even primarily as a basis for beliefs about God. It's primarily of importance in theistic religion as a way of achieving the highest good, which is a loving relationship with God.
If I have a mystical experience, an experience is so overwhelming that I know now that there's a God, the cognitive fallout from that is irrelevant. The fact that experience can be explained by a psychologist in numerous ways is irrelevant to the fact that I now know.